Hello, leader. Welcome back to the Fierce Factor podcast. It's me, your host, Kaylee here. And thank you for joining me today for episode 164, an interview with an aesthetic industry pioneer, researcher, and thought leader, board certified nurse practitioner, Leslie Fletcher. If you haven't been privy to a lecture, clinical training, business curriculum, or come across Leslie's work, you are definitely in for a treat. Leslie is a highly respected and prominent driving force in aesthetics and certainly someone to follow and potentially train with. She's a highly sought out international speaker and faculty injection trainer for our industry's leading training and pharma companies. To date, Leslie's trained over 6,000 physician and mid-level practitioners. She's authored over 20 medical aesthetic articles published in peer-reviewed journals, such as the Journal of Aesthetic Nursing, where she serves on the editorial board. Leslie's scientific research and over 20 years of lived experience as a master injector has allowed her to create her own proprietary methodologies and techniques that she teaches to practices all around the world. Leslie's the founder of Injectability Institute. They're an education company for injectors across specialties and experience levels, and her course offers educational curriculum, web-based learning, hands-on technique training, business training, and mentorship, and is one of the most well-designed and executed training programs I have come across in our space. And the reason I invited Leslie to come on today's podcast is to bring some professional insights to a very needed conversation that, candidly, I have privately with many of our injector clients and colleagues at KLC. And that is the reality that our rapidly growing industry and demand for training for new injectors to feed that demand has opened up an interesting new dynamic in aesthetics. Leslie shares in this podcast that Allergan recently published data that our industry will be in need of 10,000 new injectors per year over the next 4 to 5 years to service the consumer demand for Botox and other aesthetic services. And she's committed to helping solve this problem. And so are many other injectors. In fact, many of our clients are being independently approached by young nurses or even experienced nurses looking for training, mentorship, and guidance on how to transition into aesthetic medicine and or to develop their skills as an injector. And so we begin to ask questions like, should I be training new injectors? Should I monetize this demand? Is the next step for me to build a training institute or academy? Is this even a lucrative business model? Do I have time for this? And I think most importantly, what should be required content and training best practices for someone looking to become an independent injector trainer? So I asked Leslie all of these questions in this episode, and we dive into the do's and don'ts and red flags of training experiences that you should avoid if you're looking for conducting or being a student of your own training. And we discuss whether or not the influx of injectors in our industry is hurting or helping things. And Leslie shares some expert packing tips at the end. I always love learning from expert travelers, being someone who is not good at the carry-on game. And so be sure to stay to the end for those. And finally, Leslie shares a special offer for Fierce Factor listeners who are interested in advancing their own training with the Injectability Institute. So without further ado, please enjoy this fabulous, long overdue conversation with the one and only Leslie Fletcher on Taming the Wild West of injectable training programs. Enjoy. Hi there, welcome to the Fierce Factor podcast. I'm your host, Kaylee Lindholm. And I think it's time for us women to shift the conversation in business and step into our feminine leadership to do the most iconic work the aesthetic industry has ever seen. Each week, I'll be bringing a powerful dose of strategy, sarcasm, solutions, and sass that will rev up your creativity and ignite your brilliance as you link arms with me along our shared path of personal and professional growth in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Well, hello, Leslie Fletcher, NP, and master injector trainer, queen of traveling and instructing all over the world, by the way. I'm so excited to have nailed you down for this exciting interview on a topic you and I have been waiting to really discuss in our industry. So I would love you to just introduce yourself to the audience a little bit. Where are you today?
Yeah, so I am in Torrance, California, which is where we're located. I'm actually in my office at the Institute. So I have like a little office that I set aside for filming and podcasts, quiet, away from everything. And so that's where I'm at on this side.
I'm jealous because you're probably going to hear like a lawnmower on my side.
Oh. Well, you might actually hear a baby because 3 of our practitioners had babies this year and it's baby day. So the little daycare station is just a couple doors down. So you may hear that.
That's so cool. So I happen to have actually seen myself. I had the good fortune over, I think in December I remember it was a kind of a holiday, around holiday time, to come and take a tour of the Injectability Clinic and Training Center. And I did happen to see, I think you had babies being born and babies born.
Well, we didn't birth them here, but they were on the way.
No. Yeah. Yeah. And I thought that was so cool. And, just one thing, and I think as we really dive into the conversation today, that in itself is a testament to the way that you value your team, the way that you invest in not just developing the people, you're committed to making sure that you've built a really incredible culture. And I think that that lends itself to obviously helping you teach other practitioners how to not just inject, but also to build a business where people want to work for you and patients want to come. It's just a really incredible place. So let's talk a little bit, Leslie, about how you sort of came to be. I know people who know you obviously see you travel all over. I mean, really all over the world, but I follow you on Instagram and I don't even know how you do it. Like, how do we keep up with Leslie? But where is the passion that inspired everything that you do now? Tell us a little bit about kind of how you became Leslie Fletcher to build this clinic and now the mission that you're on.
Yeah. I mean, I really just like to say that I was at the right place at the right time. I got in at the ground floor of something completely new, a new field of medicine that didn't even exist when I started in 2001. But going back a little bit further, my friend that I went to nursing school with actually went to nursing school to be a plastic surgery nurse. And I was like 19, 20. I didn't even know like what that meant. But she and I had a passion for interior design and fashion. And we completed nursing school together. And then she did actually end up going into the field. And she called me and she's like, you have got to get into this field. It is perfect for us. It really is a great outlet for design and medicine. And there really isn't a lot in medicine like this. And so I checked it out and it was a perfect match for me. And I haven't looked back ever since. So it really was a great fit because I was able to kind of blend both sides of the brain, the right and left side, and put it together in a perfect marriage. So passion, I think, comes from being there from the beginning and watching how things have evolved. And over time, realizing that maybe the techniques and the evolution haven't been disseminated in the best way. And so you kind of become the expert when you've been there since the beginning. But then I look back at other people that I started with. They're not all, in fact, most of them aren't educators. So there has to be something else as far as like that passion for education and disseminating information and getting it out there in a way that is receivable and reproducible.
Yeah, it's funny because I ask myself all the time, is aesthetic medicine an art or a science? And it's really the one part of, I think, medicine where, and one, obviously in plastic surgery, but where they both are so incredibly important. So like from the standpoint of someone who's able to really be a great injector, I can imagine they'd have to have the visionary kind of mind and the ability to really see the art form of it. So I love that. So the purpose really for this conversation today, this stemmed from some series of conversations that you and I have had, is just me being an inquiring mind and obviously some of the nuances that I've experienced in working with clients through our work that we do at Kelsey, a lot on the business side, on the mindset of leadership and growth. And, when we work with clients, I almost have to assume that they're just really great at what they do from a clinical standpoint, that they're investing in that independently. I remember there was like a 1 or 2 week period where I had this aha moment. I was having a conversation with an injector who's been injecting for several years, and we're looking at the growth trends in her business. And I was seeing like the same number, like the same checkout, like ticket number, like the price per patient per visit, like again and again and again and again. And I was like, why is everybody getting the same thing done? What's going on? And so I was just kind of picking her brain about things. And, I just asked her, I said, can you talk to me a little bit about the consultation process? And do you not have clients that are asking for multiple syringes? And eventually she came out and said, well, I'm just not that comfortable. I've been injecting a long time, but I don't feel that great at like multiple syringes, and it kind of dawned on me that the business, there has to be really clinical competency to be able to drive the business and vice versa. And I asked another client who I started to really dive in. I started seeing some of the same things where then she said to me, I just don't want to be salesy, and I feel like I'm being salesy. And so it just really was this aha moment that I don't think it's a one and done thing. And I think when you talk about like how all these years you've been doing this since 2001, I mean, 20 something years, and there's such a richness and experience, but there has to be that kind of drive to want to learn and then continue. Like when I look at the business, you're always evolving and leveling up and shifting and pivoting and changing. And I think that that's so true on the clinical side as well. And so I want us to talk today, Leslie, and I really chose to talk to you first about this because I think that there's a very low barrier to entry, one, in our industry in terms of hanging up the shingle and saying that you are an injector. Many injectors will be frustrated and say, look, it's the wild, wild west. Anybody can say they're a master at something and it's a medical field, and at the same time, you see now I have clients that get people in their DMs like, can I come train with you? Can I come train with you? And I think there's a lot of positive, but there's also a lot of caution. And so I want to kind of just open this conversation together about this whole idea of becoming a trainer and calling yourself a trainer, right? And also starting to break down and educate what kinds of things new injectors and also growing and learning and advancing injectors should be looking for when they're choosing where to go for their training along their course, along their, I would say, professional clinical career as well. So let's start off by just talking about, like, from your perspective, new injectors, right? Like, how do they know where to go? What should they be looking for when they want to seek out training and injectables?
So I think the number one thing to look for is who's doing the education. So who are they learning from? Who is going to be their mentor at this point? Because that's going to set you on a trajectory of a different path based on who that person is. So I think picking someone that sits well with your ethos and what your goals are as an injector would be the first and foremost. So they kind of need to have a little bit of a history too, a past history, and you might be able to kind of find out their brand from online, what they excel at, do their ways resonate with your ways? Because essentially you're going to be adapting a lot of their techniques and their personality traits and a lot of their ways they deliver the message to the patient. So I think that's the first and foremost, is to set that tone with, like, and it might be a company, but what's the company's ethos as well? What's the reputation of the trainer? What are they doing to contribute to the field? Is this a person who just wants to be famous, that's like out there, like Insta famous, and, oh, I'm a trainer and I'm this and I'm that? Or do you see them at conferences? Do you see them publishing papers? Do you see them as an educationist at core, meaning that they really love to educate in all aspects of their life? Or is this something they just want to put on their Instagram handle to make their patients more excited about them, that they're a trainer? That's the first thing, I think. The next important thing is, what is the class size like? Because you'll have really well-known companies that do trainings that have kind of have a good module system, if you will, as far as their trainings go. But then when you hear feedback from people who have attended this, and I do hear this a lot, they're in a hotel room with 30 other injectors. They are sharing models. There's no consents there. Like, it's very free for all, not quite as we want it. We're not modeling best practices here. So kind of figuring out that, like, who's the owner of the company? Are they medical? Are they more corporate? What is the timing going to be on the hands-on? What's it going to be like? Am I going to have undivided attention? Or is this going to be like everybody do your own thing and there's some one or two instructors walking around checking on things? Is this company insured? If there was going to be an issue here, are they insured for education purposes? Meaning if there was some sort of AE, like who's responsible, who's the medical director, who are they working under? Are they injecting in the state that's legal? Like there's a lot of that stuff that kind of brings the package. And I think reputable companies are going to be more apt to give you those answers. Are they getting CE credits for this? Is this something that has been deemed for accreditation on that form? And then a couple other things too, like how does this company's reputation stand up in the field? Because oftentimes they get these certificates and they think they could just go knock on the door and get a job the next day. Mm-hmm. But that company is kind of known for the type of training I just described. And if someone came looking for a job here that went to one of those trainings, I would probably discount it right away in the fact that they didn't do their research on this educational company and they went to one of these events and didn't quite get that training that I was hoping they would get. So if you have another company, maybe that's more well known for a more comprehensive curriculum, that's one-on-one, hands-on, small group sizes, 5 or less, and you know, like this is a good training, that's going to give you a better leverage when it comes to job hunting. Let's see, how many people have they trained in the past? How long have they been training for? Which is kind of unfair for the people who just started. But with this field being as dynamic as it is and things changing so quickly and so rapidly, a lot of what I train is based on past 20-year experience. Like I have so much of that and I bring it to the table in the curriculum that if I just started injecting 5 years ago or a couple years ago, I don't think my curriculum would be as comprehensive as it is. So I think that really comes into play is that just kind of that experience level. Those are some things I thought of.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too, and I shared the story with you before that we had a client actually who I've had on this podcast and she told the story on the podcast was that she went to a training, like a weekend course somewhere, and she ended up like teaching it. She said it was unbelievable. You know, this is a brilliant woman, a lot of experience and MD behind her name. And so like, I'm sure she did her homework, you know, but it can be very deceiving.
It can be. So I think you need to dig deeper into the questions. And one other question I think we should be asking is, are the classes set up in a way where we're all going to have this similar amount of experience? Because that can be very frustrating, like your client. And I've heard this before too. Like I took an advanced class and there was a beginner in there, like asking how to reconstitute Botox. So it can really distract you, derail you from a trajectory of advanced training to like, oh my gosh, I got to take care of this person. And so you end up kind of babysitting over here and missing out on some of those other people. And vice versa. If you have someone who is in a fundamental class or a foundations class and they're a little bit more experienced, that could be frustrating for them too. So making sure that there's a good relationship with whoever is doing the placement, like there's an interview beforehand maybe to find out, tell me about your experience, about your practice, tell me a little bit more, and then let me find the class that best suits your needs versus you going in and just picking from a drop down, assuming that because it's advanced, it's going to be advanced.
Right. No, that's such a good point. And also, what does advanced even mean?
Right. And that is an arbitrary term. So maybe giving some specifics.
Yeah. What are like some of the red flags to look for? And I guess this is there's such a spectrum here as we're talking about like training academies, you know, and some that are well known. And I also think there's some benefit too to like just learning other people's technique, you know, learning a few different ways, like nobody, you know, and taking what you want from it, whatever. But like, are there some red flags that like, just if you see this or this happens along the process or you show up and this is going on, like this is a red flag for you?
Well, unfortunately, if you show up and it's already going on, you're kind of stuck because you're already there. So you paid the money and there's really, at that point, it's going to be a challenge to get out of it. But again, I think it's those questions ahead of time, like where is this class going to be held? And if it's held in a hotel, I personally feel like that is a red flag because it's not medical. You're going to be injecting in surroundings that's not going to be typical what you're going to be used to in the clinic. And then the assumption is that the reason it's in a hotel is because there's going to be so many people that we couldn't fit in a clinic kind of a thing. So that would be another red flag. Also, what type of curriculum can I expect to leave with, to hear during the didactic and leave with? And if they tell you, oh, you know what, we just spend most of the time on hands-on because that's what's important to people. That to me is a red flag because not really. I think what is important is setting the foundation up with that evidence-based curriculum, giving them a piece of material to go home with and study, a manual, if you will. And that's the kind of stuff that actually takes a ton of time. And to me, sort of separates the great educators from the I want to be an educator, is the ones who just kind of want to be an educator but aren't interested in running an educational institution, aren't spending the time writing, copywriting, designing curriculum, printing it off, changing it every time you teach. That's the stuff that really separates, I think. So I think that's a great question to ask. Like, what kind of materials am I going to leave with? And if it's, oh, we'll give you a printout, what does that printout look like? Is it like 3 pages? Is it black and white? Is it in color? Am I going to be able to read it? Or the slide's going to be so small? So those enduring materials, I think, are really important. And then how long is the class? That's another red flag. If you have an advanced class or even a foundational class that's like 4 hours, that's a big red flag because there's so much to cover. And if it's limited in time to 4 hours, I think that would be a red flag for me. And then I would always like to know how long, what portion of that is didactic and what portion is hands-on. Both are very important. But if you miss one of those pieces, I think you're missing a big piece to the entire puzzle.
Yeah, let's talk about those puzzle pieces because we have several clients that have their own training centers in their facility. And I think something that I learned as you took the time to walk me through and show me the process, even how the whole client journey from when they come in to a meeting with having a consultation with the provider, then to the consultant that you have that talks about really like the pricing stuff, the whole approach to how you, even the bedside manner, all of that kind of stuff. I think that to me, that's so important. Going back to like the first example of realizing that there's the clinical confidence that you have to have, like too, when you leave that training program and you learn how to do something, you have to do it, right? And so there's the process of that. So I'm sure like some part of follow-up or the mentorship kind of component, but then also ability to talk to a patient, like, you know, really. And like, if you feel like you're being salesy versus showing them. And I think there was an example you showed me about, like you showed their after photo, the patient came in, or I'm sorry, the before photo from months before saying, oh no, I think I'm okay. And you were saying, that's fine. There's no pressure whatsoever. I'm just showing you that this is the changes that have occurred. So you're educating them. So let's kind of talk about those components and those pieces of what a comprehensive training should include.
And that's one of the reasons I love hosting it at our facility, because we can model best practices from beginning to end. So our clinic is attached to our institute, but we have our institute set up like a clinic. So there's, an injection room and there's an imaging room for before and after images. And we show them how that consultation process goes. I always tell people, like, I can teach you how to put in 8 to 10 syringes in a patient, but if I can't teach you how to sell it, then that's pointless. I can teach you how to sell 8 to 10 syringes, but if you don't know what to do with those afterwards, then you're screwed too. So you got to have both, because in order to progress and to be more comfortable injecting multiple syringes, which is frankly where the field is going, pan-facial rejuvenation is much more natural looking than spot treating. We know this from studies. We also just know this when we look at the fastest growing practices and people who are really excelling and rising to the top. There are multiple syringe injectors and touching multiple places on the face, facial balancing, pan-facial rejuvenation, whatever you want to call it. That is definitely the trend. And so I love to teach that. So I love to teach it from beginning to end. And you had mentioned our consultation process has kind of 4 parts. I produced a webinar on it that shows everything step by step by step, 2.5-hour webinar that we still have available. And it's filmed here in the practice, so you can see how it rolls out. But the consultation expert that we have doesn't do pricing. I think that should be reserved for the prescriber, the one who's actually giving the prescription of what we're doing. She gives a lot of other things. She credentials the injectors. She talks about, bruising and questions, real world questions. What's it going to feel like? Are we going to numb you? And all those kind of pre-questions, and shows before and after images of other patients in their same decade. And so she does a lot of that pre-work for us, which is making me productive because I'm in another room injecting during that time. Right. And then they roll through my practice or my office, my clinic room. And then that's when I sit down and write the whole plan out for them with the quote. And it's a whole process, and it's a little bit longer than what I could go over here in this. But that modeling best behavior is really crucial. And if I'm doing this training in a hotel room somewhere, like those pieces aren't there. They can't see how everything fits, how I hand them the pre-work and then the post-care sheet, and how it just is all part of this well-oiled machine here to, if one of those pieces of the puzzle is missing, it just doesn't seem to come together as nicely.
So I'm curious your thoughts on this, because the reality is there's an influx of the demand is growing everywhere, right? Our industry is going to triple like in the next decade. We have a lot of new nurses. And for that reason, there's this innate demand for a lot of new training programs, right? Or a lot of people who feel like, okay, well, I'm the experienced one now because there's a lot of newbies in the field. Is this influx of training programs, is this helping or hurting our industry?
So that was a great question that you posed to me. I think it could be both. I would hope to think it's mostly good. So the statistics are, and I got this from my digital help friends at Allergan, the market growth is expected to double within 5 years, and they need 10,000 new injectors a year for the next 5 years. That's 50,000 injectors in order to cover that market growth. And so 50,000 new injectors in the next 5 years. Clinical proficiency isn't really being met until an injector is seeing 30 patients per month full time for 5 years. So doing the math, it's going to be a while before we catch up, which just means those of us who have clinical proficiency and have experience and tenure, if you will, are going to be super busy for the next 5 years, because that's what we need. We need those experienced people to keep the market growing as fast as it is, because it's only going to grow as fast as those clinical outcomes are good. If the clinical outcomes go down and we're seeing poor outcomes, it's going to stunt the growth for everybody. So that's why education is so important to me, because it matters to everybody that we're getting good outcomes, because it pushes the needle farther as far as industry growth or medical field growth. So is it helping or hurting? It depends. If you are having an educator out there that is teaching bad habits or poor habits from the beginning, not teaching evidence-based medicine, that's just setting up the next generation for poor outcomes, which is going to affect the industry as a whole. But if you can get some sort of, I know you and I had talked about maybe getting some sort of, what were we calling it? I don't even know, but just a way to vet some of these educators and making sure that there's some sort of a standard on these educational companies or people educating, then that is going to just rise everything up higher. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess. I don't know how to answer that, I guess. It really depends on where you're taking your education to see if it's going to help or hurt.
Well, and I think if I asked this question to 20 injectors, I'd get 20 different answers. And it's hard to separate yourself too, right? Like the reality is, because if you asked me like, oh, if there were 20 new pop leadership academies, well, it's like, well, I could care less about one more of them. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, if there's that demand, it's so interesting, because when you started to talk about the need for 10,000 new injectors a year, I'm sorry, my mind is blown. That's
the need. So we will have a nursing shortage, if you will, a medical shortage if we don't train 10,000 new injectors a year, because the way the trends are going, the demand is so high that we need people to deliver the services.
Yeah.
And you look at how many people you can see in a day, and that's how all those statistics get put together. And if we don't train 10,000 new injectors a year to have positive outcomes, we will definitely have a plateau or a crash, and we will have a shortage of medical providers injecting.
Look, and when we say this, like, I would think that then if this was the case, every single business should be completely slammed. Like, there shouldn't be any business, med spa, injector that is not fully booked.
And in the real world, mostly they are. I think the good ones are. And I'm not even saying you have to be great. I always like to say this. You started out with like the branding and the patient experience. You could be a mediocre injector, mediocre, but having a beautiful patient experience and care for the patient and spend time with the patient, and you will flourish. There is no doubt, because people are craving the experience and they crave that relationship. So it's not necessarily like, oh, you have to be a 22-year injector with patents and doing all this other stuff to be good. You just have to care for your patient patient and treat them kindly. Like, it's not that hard. But in the end, people, I think like, oh, I'm only going to be better if I take all of these classes and do all this stuff. And that was another point I was going to bring up, is that sometimes people actually see education as almost like it's like their stamp of approval, and they get a little bit hindered if they aren't constantly educating. They're like trapped by the notion that if they're only as good as the next class that they take. And so they're crippled and their confidence is stunted until they can take another class on anatomy or another class on cadaver. And it's like, at some point, you're going to have to trust that you know what to do and actually execute some of this stuff. You can't just keep signing up for classes. I mean, education is great and we should always sign up. But if we're finding our value in that only and never trusting ourselves and having that confidence, then it really doesn't do you any good. So there's another way to look at education. Most people are undereducated, I'll say, but there is another subset of people who are very skilled, very talented, but they continue to just don't have the confidence that they need to get to their patients and do the right thing for them.
Okay, leader, thank you so much for joining me for part 1 of this incredible episode. And be sure to join us next week for the second half of Taming the Wild West of Injectable Training Programs with the one and only Leslie Fletcher, NP. Wait, before you go, if you're vibing with this conversation and want to join me on my mission to help 1,000 inspiring and intentional women cross the next $1 million milestone in their business this year, or maybe you want to become one of them, head over to Facebook and join our free community, the Fierce Factor Society. Over there, we are taking this conversation to an elevated level. Get access to resource guides, podcast supplements, and guideposts, direct communication with me and my expert team, and of course, a society of fierce women making big moves and disrupting the status quo in aesthetics and wellness. You can link directly through the show notes or head to Facebook and search up the Fierce Factor Society. See you there, goddess.